Our first reading tonight is from the book of Isaiah. It's called the Song of the Suffering Servant. And we have absolutely no idea at all about whom this song is written. We just don't know. For hundreds of years, people have been guessing that the suffering servant perhaps is Job, perhaps it's somebody else that Isaiah knew who remained nameless. But the suffering servant, as his suffering was described in that first reading, the suffering servant is never identified. When the early church read that chapter from Isaiah, the Song of the Suffering Servant, of course, they immediately thought of Jesus. But originally, the Song of the Suffering Servant was not written about Jesus. It was only later applied to him as Christians began to reflect on his suffering and were looking for passages in the Old Testament that could reflect that life. And so the early church lit upon the Song of the Suffering Servant as the perfect description of how Jesus lived his life and how Jesus suffered his many sufferings. If you look through this booklet, as I'm looking through it right now, John Richard highlighted all of the parts that are assigned to Jesus. There are very, very few. Jesus did not have much to say in his passion narrative. Everybody else had a lot to say, but Jesus had precious little. That's typical of the suffering servant. He was led before people. He was accused of many, many terrible things, and yet he opened not his mouth. He didn't mount a powerful defense. He didn't hire a battery or a squad of high-powered attorneys that could defend him. He simply let people make their accusations, and they had their way with him. As we read in this passion narrative, they had their way with the Lord. If we apply this truth, if we apply this sense of destiny and mission to our own lives, perhaps we see a lot of parallels. We have gone through suffering. We have been misunderstood. We have been falsely accused. We have been taken out of turn. We have been accused of things that we never did. And yet, sometimes it's just easier to let things go and to say a prayer for the accuser and just to get on with our lives. And I think that's what Jesus did. It would have been easy for him to call down scores of angels from heaven and simply wipe out the entire city of Jerusalem. He could have done it, but he didn't. He didn't. And as a result of that, our redemption and our eventual resurrection was a benefit of that, was a result of that. Here we are on Good Friday, and we're facing Holy Saturday tomorrow and then Easter Sunday. And we're looking at eventual outcomes for terrible things that have happened. About 12 years ago, a terrible thing happened to St. Margaret. There was a schism here. There was a split. It was ugly and it was nasty. And half of your congregation went another way, and you are the faithful remnant. Here you are. You're still rebuilding, and you're still recovering, and you're still healing. And yet, you're not dead. Far from it. You're really very much alive and very much full of the Spirit of God's love and God's healing and God's truth. Come Easter Sunday, that will become even more obvious as we celebrate the Lord's resurrection. Terrible things can happen to us. There's no question about it. But it's all in how we deal with those terrible things. It's all in how we react to the suffering that is thrust upon us. For your part, as I surveyed these beautiful, gorgeous 14 Stations of the Cross at noon today when we had the Stations of the Cross, I was struck by how faith-filled the people who were here were and are, and how all of you are. I was struck by the tenacity and yet the goodwill and not a little good humor in terms of getting yourself up and dusting yourself off and picking up and going on with life. That's what we're supposed to do. That's what the Lord is asking us to do. He never said it would be easy, and God knows it isn't, but he always said that he would have our backs and that he would see us through to the end. So for the suffering that your parish has gone through, there is Resurrection Day. And every day that good is accomplished and evil is vanquished, every day that happens, then that's a victory for St. Margaret. And it's a victory for all of you, and it's a victory for Christ and his baptized people. Let's continue to persevere. Perseverance is a real important virtue. Let's ask the Lord to give us the grace of perseverance, the stamina that we need just to get up, dust ourselves off, and keep walking. Amen. Amen. God be praised.